Because that was pretty loud, so I'm going to take that as a good sign. Well, thank you for that warm introduction. So I'm talking about faith and innovation because this is the Mays Innovation Research Center, or MERC. Or MERC?
Yeah, MERC.
Okay, MERC. Yeah. So I know more about faith than innovation just at the outset, but here we go. So my thesis is that real progress occurs within a tight social fabric that both prompts and sustains entrepreneurship, and that governments alone cannot do the work of creating the social capital because governments themselves arise within certain cultural contexts that are not of their own making. Now, religion shapes cultures in various ways, and I'm going to argue that one religion in particular has shown itself to be preeminently capable of creating the civil society that fosters innovation. So I'm not actually talking about, like, how do you create widgets, because I'm just a philosopher, but I'm talking about what are the background conditions for innovation and what role does faith play in creating and fostering those background conditions. One of the things I like to say is if you can't practice your religion in your living room, then why do you think you can start building computers in your garage? So, what is the connection between having and encouraging the free discussion of ideas for any purpose and fostering and contributing to technological innovation? So that's the thesis. I want to talk about law, and then I want to talk about social capital. So first, I'm going to tell you why. So I added this slide in here. Why this lecture and why innovation? Well, why this lecture? Free marketeers sometimes disdain religion. So what we really need to do, people who are advocates of the free market would say, is simply and only encourage people to look at economic graphs. And this is going to win the political day. And to those that would say that the way that we encourage people to have lower tax rates is we go and we show them certain slides about, certain graphs and charts, I want to say to them, no, you need to have connection points with people where they really are. And so where people are religiously is something that should inform people who are making the case for the free market. Now, then I want to say that sometimes it's the Christians versus the free marketeers. I don't know what the religious landscape is like at Texas A&M, but if I think about my own institution, JBU, there are many students who hear the clarion call of equality and say, that's wonderful. So if they're Christians, they say, wow, everyone should make the same amount of money. What's wrong with that? So there's a sense in which Christians can be co-opted by enemies of the free market, and I want to make the case that Christians should be enamored with the free market. Now, why do we have innovation? It's embarrassing to sit in front of economists talking as a philosopher about why we have innovation, but in my, I was about to say 20,000-foot view, but maybe it's my 120,000-foot view, I think that we have innovation because we have limited needs, but we have unlimited wants. We have limited needs. We need food, clothing, and shelter, but we have unlimited wants. So I don't know about you, but when the iPad first came out, I thought it was the most ridiculous invention. Who would ever have an iPad, right? What a dumb thing. I think we now have 4 iPads associated with my family, just because we find them so useful, right? That's why the most recognizable brands today are not food, shelter, and clothing companies, right? We don't know the brands that meet our limited needs. Instead, the brands that we recognize are the brands, I don't know if you can see this. Oh yeah, it's huge. So the brands, these are the most recognizable brands in the world. These brands are not associated with our limited needs. They're associated with our unlimited wants. I mean, you may think that Mercedes-Benz is part of your needs category, but it's not. So where are these are these companies? One of the things that I want us to notice is that the top Interbrand companies are in California, California, Washington, Washington, Georgia, South Korea, Japan, Germany, California, California. So if you look at where companies are that have global recognition, they are largely in the United States. China, which is a huge country, a large economy, has yet to produce a Google, an Apple, an Amazon, or a Toyota. All right, so that's a little bit of why faith and innovation. I think that sometimes they're religiously minded people who are sheepish about the market, and they're champions of the market who have a little bit of disdain for religiously minded people. So that's the idea here. So I want to see some connection points between faith and innovation, looking at law and also at social capital. Okay, so when we think of what kind of legal structures do we put in place that foster innovation, so I thought of 4: private property, impartiality, freedom, and democracy. Why do you want private property if you, why are we concerned about property rights if we're trying to foster innovation? Well, people innovate when they know that they can keep the fruits of their labor. Absent private property, you don't actually get that kind of innovation. Also, we want impartiality. I think that impartiality, if you said what is the most important thing in law, I would argue for impartiality. So the idea, as we'll consider in a moment, that the law is not a respecter of persons. So if I'm a judge, then the question is, did you break the law? It's not, are you rich or poor? Are you black or white? Are you a Buddhist or are you a Christian? Those things don't matter. The question is the law. I think impartiality is incredibly important because sometimes people who are innovators are actually people that would otherwise be on the margins of society. And so if there are robust property rights for the kind of privileged class, but the law isn't applied impartially, then innovators are going to be left at the margins. Of course, freedom is incredibly important to innovate, and I want to argue that freedom in ideas, just being able to speak freely about ideas, coordinates highly with the desire or the willingness to try to build a computer in your garage, which I think is a reference to the start of Apple. Isn't that right? Wozniak, didn't they build it in his garage or something like that? All right, just showing my innovation sophistication. All right, then there's democracy. I think that democracy, just in terms of economic growth, there's a coordination between democracy and economic growth, so you actually get the financial wealth to help fund projects in innovation. Now, how does faith come in? How does faith come into the conversation about law? Well, obviously, people could appeal to specific legal prohibitions. It's really fascinating if you look at, has anybody here looked at the kind of Massachusetts Bay, the early colonial laws? I don't know if you've ever done that, but there's a book that Daniel Dreisbach and Mark David Hall co-edited called Sacred Rights of Conscience, where you can look at a lot of the early American charters and colonial law, and it is surprising how the early colonists would simply say, stealing is prohibited in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Exodus 20:15. So as a matter of history, it is amazing how the concern for private property was built out of this concern for the Eighth Commandment. Something else, now I'm stealing this, but if you steal it, then it's not actually, if you attribute the theft, then in philosophy world, it's not theft. So Judge Vince Smith is the chief judge of the Eighth Circuit so he's a federal judge, and he's the chief judge of the Eighth Circuit. And I heard him give this example, and so I'm just stealing it. So what Judge Smith did was he said, I used the King James or authorized version of the Bible just to kind of give you the flavor of the language that would have been in place in the development of America. So look at Deuteronomy chapter 1. Ye shall not respect persons in judgment, but ye shall hear the small as well as the great. Ye shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. And the cause that is too hard for you, bring it unto me. This is the Lord speaking, and I will hear it. Now you shall not respect persons in judgment. What does that mean? It means that if there's the rich person who broke the law and there's the poor person who broke the law, then the question is, did the person break the law? The question is not, well, is this somebody important in our community or not? This Old Testament concern, which is throughout the Old Testament, is repeated in the New Testament, 1 Peter 1:17. And if you call on the Father, who without respect of persons judgeth according to every man's work, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear. So notice, Samuel Gregg has a new book out. It was just published this past year called Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. And the way that I would kind of synthesize his book is to say that the Western civilization is rational and free because the God of Western civilization is rational and free. Notice that the command here in the injunction here in 1 Peter is actually attributing to God rationality and freedom, and it's not respecting persons, so impartiality and justice. Now, Judge Smith had this awesome example. So what is this a picture of? Come on. Do I have to say howdy before, like, to kind of wake you up here, people? What is this a picture of? It's a bat. Yeah, maybe this is Texas A&M, so maybe some of you are trying to struggle to say, like, well, what kind of fruit bat is that or whatever, like you were looking, whereas I'm just a philosopher, so that's a bat. Now, why would I have a bat with a quote from, this is a quote from a Supreme Court case from 1881. Anybody know? Because the Scotland, I'll tell you, the Scotland was a ship that was sailing out of New York, and it was struck, and the Bat Guano sunk. The Scotland sunk, and the Bat Guano sunk. And apparently this was, hot stuff. In the 1800s, Bat Guano was used for fertilizer. In this U.S. Supreme Court case, the question was raised, under whose jurisdiction do we actually try the case? Is this a maritime case, so it's just an open waters case? Is it the Scotland case, which presumably was British? I think it was struck by a ship from South America, but it's in New York Harbor. And the Supreme Court said, well, there's some instances when you're in the middle of the ocean that maritime law has to apply. But in all other cases, each nation will also administer justice according to its own laws. And it will do this without what? Without respect of persons, to the stranger as well as to the citizen. So notice that embedded in a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1881 is the exact same kind of language and concern that we see in the Bible about God not being a respecter of persons, and so judges doing the best they can to not be a respecter of persons. And again, this is important for innovation because if you're innovating, you don't want to pause and say, wait, if I have some kind of conflict, will the court decide against me simply and only because I'm at the margins of society? So here I think this is where faith provides background conditions for innovation. Now, just as a kind of aside here, I am a Christian, so I think the Christian faith is true, but it's not to say that you have to be a Christian to recognize that Christianity can actually have some kind of net positive social benefit. I don't know if you know the story about the atheist journalist who was talking about the continent of Africa. And the atheist journalist actually said, Africa needs Jesus, by which he meant Africa needs the kind of social capital that Christians can develop. All right, next one, freedom. So this is somebody burning a newspaper. It's amazing what you find on the internet. But let's just take the First Amendment. So we have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, the right to speak against the government. Now, where do these freedoms as a question of history come from? Well, it's interesting. Don Lutz there, that's the majority of the references. He traced 7 of the enumerated rights in the Bill of Rights, the first amendments to the Constitution, to English common law. So only 7 of the 27. And what's interesting is that Lutz actually surveyed the, just imagine doing this. He surveyed political pamphlets at the time of the American founding. And if it was a sermon, he discounted it entirely. So if it was a published sermon, no, I'm not even going to consider it. So only, now if it was a minister who wrote a political pamphlet, he would count it. But he explicitly excluded all religious-only work. And what he found was that even in the work at the time of the founding, the biggest reference was to the Bible. You see 34%. As opposed to Enlightenment workers, thinkers, we think of somebody like Locke or Montesquieu, 22% in total, or the classics. So the founders loved the classics, but it's not as though they just kept referencing Cicero. If I remember correctly, this is off the cuff, so you can fault me for it later in the video. You know, you can do the research. But I'm pretty sure that the book of Deuteronomy, right, no respecter of persons, that the book of Deuteronomy was referenced more in political writings at the time of the American founding than the works of John Locke. So a single book in the Bible got more reference than John Locke. So again, if we're talking about freedoms, and you could go 2 ways about this. You could say, well, the freedoms are there regardless of whether or not we recognize it. Or you could say the Christians invented these freedoms. Or you could say, no, they're natural rights, but there's something about Christianity that enabled or encouraged, or maybe Judaism and Christianity that enabled or encouraged this kind of reflection. Now, it's really interesting. This is controversial about democracy. So Robert Woodbury, The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy. Has anybody read this essay? I highly recommend this. This is Woodbury's work was so controversial for the American Political Science Association that they made him publish or make available online his entire data set. So anybody in the world could check his work. So basically, what Woodbury does is he considers this question. Protestantism is associated with stable representative democracy in Western Europe, although many argue that this association is spurious. So what Woodbury did was he tried to get as much information as possible and control for all variables. So how far away are you from a coast? What's your average, your average mean summertime high? Your winter lows, just coordinating all of the data sets possible and try to say, is there a positive correlation between some kind of missionary endeavor in your country? So if I've got Brucetania, if you made my last name sound like a ship, if I've got Brucetania and it's just us Bruces and we don't believe in anything, what kind of religious group would I want to come to my shores, just from a perspective of developing a democracy? And what Woodbury does is he argues that conversionary Protestants, I think that the term evangelical actually came into being in like the 1940s in the U.S. with the National Association of Evangelicals. But I think that to speak anachronistically, we could say that evangelicals, but he uses the phrase conversionary Protestants because he's trying to be historically sensitive that that the term wasn't used. There is the term in German in Germany, but it just meant what we would call Lutheran. All right, so in trying to spread their faith, conversionary Protestants expanded religious liberty, overcame resistance to mass education and printing, fostered civil society, moderated colonial abuses, and dissipated elite power. These conditions laid a foundation for democracy and long-term economic growth. Now, what's interesting is that Protestant missions predict democracy, whereas Catholic missions do not. So if you look at countries across the world where they're thriving democracies, then Woodbury says it's more likely than not that conversionary Protestants went there as opposed to even other Christian denominations. All right. And this is because he argues of social capital. So let's think about the relationship between social capital and innovation. Innovation, I mean, I haven't done any, remember I'm just a philosopher, so I haven't done any vast social scientific work, but I'm guessing that literacy is strongly coordinated with innovation. Like that the people being able to read is good for innovation. So again, what we're thinking about is what are the background conditions, that faith helps foster that can contribute to innovation. I also think there's something to be said for the dignity of work. That if you can get people to say, hey, working is good, working is valuable, that also fosters innovation. And then individual growth and progress, a concern for the development of the individual as an individual, as opposed to just being a representative of the group. And then finally, I think that, and we'll talk about this when we actually consider it, but I think that some kind of grace from the community is important if you want to foster innovation, because people will fail. And people will know in advance what kind of expectations, they'll have certain expectations about what failure will look like in a certain culture. Will failure, and I'm not being glib, but will failure look like I should commit ritual suicide in order to preserve and protect the honor of my family? That won't really encourage me. I mean, maybe you're just better than I am, but if I have to commit ritual suicide, if my center that I'm the inaugural director of doesn't work out, I wouldn't have started my center, right? I like my life too much. All right, so let's think about these things here. First of all, literacy. Conversionary Protestants want people to read the Bible and be able to interpret the Bible. And so they are incredibly committed to literacy. And you can see here that Woodbury actually contrasts Protestant with Roman Catholic literacy rates, and countries that are more Protestant than Roman Catholic have higher literacy rates, and then he actually goes down to a kind of county and individual level. And just for fun, because we all love India, I thought that I would use India as an example, again, stealing from Woodbury here. So within 32 years of importing a printing press to India in 1800, 3 British missionaries printed more than 212,000 copies of books in 40 languages, and along with other missionaries created the fonts and paper that dominated South Asian printing for much of the 19th century. One of the fun things about conversionary Protestants going into a country, teaching people how to read, and churning out all of this missionary literature is that elites of rival religions understandably get upset, and so they want to get in on the printing press game too. Where do they learn how to print their anti-Christian material? They learn it from the missionaries. So from a literacy perspective, having a religious printing war as opposed to an actual religious war, but having a religious printing press war is fantastic, because everybody wants to read what's hot off the press from this Hindu against this Christian, or this Christian writing against this Muslim. It actually creates and fosters a tremendous amount of literacy. Now let's talk about the dignity of labor. So Tomas Sedlacek, The Economics of Good and Evil, it's a fantastic book. He's a Czech economist, and they made, this is hard to believe, though we all love economics, this is hard to believe, but they actually made his book into like a stage play. So he charts from the Epic of Gilgamesh, so early human written work, to the present the idea of good and evil within economics. Now, what we have here are Orthodox Jews, and they're keeping the Sabbath. They're keeping the Sabbath. And one of the amazing things that Sedlacek talks about, who is, as best I know, he's not a Jew, but Sedlacek says, what this communicates is that your worth is not in your labor alone. Your worth is not in your labor alone. Now, what that means is it means that you have a dignity apart from your productivity. But the Sabbath also means that you better be working 6 days a week. Right? 6 days you shall labor, and the seventh you shall rest. Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who toured America in the 19th century, one of the funnest things from my perspective that he writes is he talks about, I think it's New Englanders, and who at the time were Sabbath keepers. So he talks about how on Sunday there was absolutely no activity in the town. You would think that the people had no idea of commerce whatsoever. But then if you were there Monday morning, you saw that they were ready to make money. They worked like crazy. And so this kind of balance, this rhythm of life, is very, I think, helpful for innovation. Because Matt Wilson, he's at Harvard, and he has written on the virtue of taking ownership in a project. And every virtue is a mean between two extremes, which are vices. And the virtue of taking ownership in a project, Matt says, there's the vice of not taking enough initiative, like not making it your own. But there's the contrasting vice, which is saying, if my tech company fails, then my life is over. Because everything in my existence belongs to the success or failure of my company. That creates a horrible, neurotic work environment. So it's somebody who has a respect for the dignity of labor, but also individual dignity apart from productivity, I think is set to be a fantastic entrepreneur. All right, growth and progress. So Genesis chapter 1, this may be more Bible than you've heard in this room ever, right? I don't know. But Genesis chapter 1, God makes man, male and female, after his own image, and he gives them dominion, and he says, be fruitful and multiply. So there is a concern right at the start of the Bible for human productivity. Now, I found this quote, F.A. Hayek. I would assume he was an atheist, but somebody told me he may be an agnostic. But by no means a Christian, much less an evangelical. This is not, Friedrich Hayek, Nobel Prize winner in economics. In his work, The Road to Serfdom, the quote is slightly different, but his book became really influential and popular, and so Reader's Digest published a little edition of The Road to Serfdom in April 1945. Listen to this quote from Hayek. So not a Christian. Individualism, in contrast to socialism and all other forms of totalitarianism, is based on the respect of Christianity for the individual and the belief that it's desirable that men should be free to develop their own individual gifts and bents. So here is somebody who is an unbeliever, who's outside the Christian camp, who nevertheless has a historical sensibility and can appreciate Christianity's contribution to the human experiment. All right, now grace. Again, I get this one from Thomas Sedlacek, The Economics of Good and Evil. Sedlacek talks about bankruptcy laws. And if you push back and say, no, that's not actually the history of bankruptcy laws, I'll just capitulate, because I don't know the history of bankruptcy laws. But Sedlacek claims that bankruptcy laws were put in place from a kind of Christian charity, from a concern to give people grace, to give them a second chance. But he talks about, as an economist, how beneficial it is that there is a law in place that if I'm an entrepreneur, and I go bankrupt, that I don't think I'm not going to be sold into debt slavery in the United States. My kids are not going to starve to death. And how that has created the enormous opportunity for people to say, I'm going to try this. And if I fail, it doesn't mean that I will ruin my family forever. So Sedlacek says, here's a Christian concern for grace and charity to improve people who are down on their luck, but it actually has positive economic benefits because people who are thinking about being entrepreneurs can actually say, failure does not mean complete and utter financial ruin forever. There is hope for a turnaround. All right, so faith and innovation, one of the things I always like to do when I ever give a lecture is I call them preemptive strikes. So you may have objections forming in your mind, and maybe I don't get those, and then the philosophy love language is actually a critical objection to the thesis of a lecture. So there'll be no question too hard. You just may hear me say, I don't know, or, but I like pushback. But one of the things I thought of was, what kind of objections could you have to the idea that Christianity could actually foster innovation? Well, I've got 3 of them. So the first is, well, this sounds racist. The second is, it sounds imperialistic. And the third is, you're just blind to counterexamples. Surely there are a bunch of nations out there where Christianity is nothing, and yet they have a flourishing democracy, there's lots of innovation, and their stock market's going like crazy. Well, let's first consider the racist objection. Aren't you saying that there is just by saying that there's a certain religion that actually fosters these things, isn't this actually insulting to people who are from other parts of the world where historically there's not been Christianity? Isn't this kind of racist? Well, my response to that is actually twofold. First of all, it's not actually racist because the beliefs of Christianity float free from any kind of race or historical background. So there are, I think, there are more, you can check me on this, but I think it's Nigeria, that there are more Anglicans in Nigeria than in England today. So it's not as though that Christianity is a race-based religion. There are religions that are ethnically connected. So I had a roommate when I was at Oxford who was Zoroastrian. And he, in order for his kids to be Zoroastrian, worship fire, in order for his kids to be Zoroastrian, he had to marry a Zoroastrian. And if you didn't marry a Zoroastrian, then your kids weren't Zoroastrian. Now, I'm not actually saying that Zoroastrians are racist, but that's actually connecting a religion to a particular ethnicity. The other thing that I said I'd say 2 things. The other thing I wanted to say was that and this is René Girard, is a French philosopher now deceased, but one of the points that he makes is looking at the history of the world. If you look at the classical world and you said, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy? If you look at Greek plays, then you would say, well, that guy's the bad guy. Why? Because he's not part of the community. Community's good. The person outside the community is bad. And Girard notes that along comes Christianity. Along comes Christianity, and Western civilization says, this is Jesus. This is the unruly mob. So all of a sudden, there's actually a concern for the outsider that culturally there wasn't before. If you were the outcast in Greek society, you were the outcast. Whereas with the advent of Christianity, there was the legitimate concern that the entire community could be mistaken. All right, isn't this imperialistic? Now, how do these conversionary Protestants get to certain places? Well, I'm not going to try to paint a really happy picture, and I don't know the history of all of the different settlements of conversionary Protestants. But I think that one thing we could say is there are probably conversionary Protestants, evangelicals, who are engaged in this sort of missionary endeavor, who are horrible people, right? We can just grant that there are probably people that did all sorts of terrible things. But I also think we can look at the historical record and we can actually see that there were many evangelical Protestants who were decidedly concerned about all sorts of things that we wouldn't expect them to be concerned about. So, for example, I had a friend who did his PhD in Japanese literature at Yale. And I said, why does Yale have Japanese literature stuff? Like, how did that happen? And he said that it was actually old Yale missionaries who were what? Who were concerned about preserving and protecting Japanese culture. So they wanted all the Japanese to come to faith in Jesus, but they also wanted to be sure that Japanese culture was preserved. All right, the last thing here, counterexamples. What about a country like Japan? Japan has Toyota, right? Isn't this a counterexample to the general claim that conversionary Protestants are predictors of democracy and economic growth and foster social capital and legal structures that contribute to innovation? Well, it's interesting about Japan. It is true that Shintoism and Buddhism are the majority religions in Japan, but Japan has actually had several Christian prime ministers, along with its world-class companies. So it may be that, and here I'm being a little mischievous, it may be that there's a kind of ideal percentage of evangelicals in a country, and maybe you don't want, just from a sociological or an economic point of view, maybe you don't want like 75% or 95%, but maybe there's like a 5 or 10% that actually contributes and fosters these sorts of concerns for impartiality. I'll end with an anecdote, and I'm not going to mention names, and because we're video recording, but there is a major corruption case in South America, and I was talking to somebody, people involved, and I said I had a student from that country who told me that everybody fighting corruption in that country was an evangelical Protestant. Is that true? And the guy that I was talking to actually said to me, oh yeah, so-and-so, he's a friend of mine. He's a Baptist. Right? So there's something to be said for people actually taking seriously the call to impartiality and trying to put it into place. All right, I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. Are you raising your hand over there?
Yes, I am.
Great.
I have several questions. I take issue with more than one thing.
Great.
One, I think your focus on innovation is very, not just modern, but contemporary. So you're looking at innovation in the past, as defined in the past 20 years, 30 years. Whereas I thought, especially looking at it from a philosophical point of view, you might have gone back centuries, because the could say our alphabet an innovation, our number system, the Roman aqueduct, the fact that for example, there seems to be a dichotomy between Protestant Christianity and Catholicism, but the university itself, which was sat, was an innovation of the Catholic Church. The body of knowledge has been transmitted down centuries, where money was written by Catholic monks. Structure of education, primary school, secondary school, elementary
Sure.
school, and so on. So I don't know. And second thing, I don't know if correlation could be said to be equated to a cause, because that would mean if the more innovative corporations in the United States is practicing a purer form of Christianity, or had Christianity embedded in a purer form in its social construct than France or Italy or Germany or United Kingdom. So I don't know, I'm trying to reconcile those among those.
Yeah, so I'll repeat back the question that I'll do them each in turn, and then you can tell me whether I've been fair to your question. And so you see what I'm saying? You can give me a yes or no. I don't want to start answering a question without actually you going, no, that is my question. So the first is, aren't you thinking of innovation more recently? Shouldn't you take a longer period? And if you took a longer period, then the evangelical Protestant influence would drop out. Or it would, I'm not trying to, it would be minimized, or I'm not trying to, something like that?
In more accurate context.
Okay. Yeah, so it's interesting because if you think of evangelical Protestantism developing in the 16th century, in some sense, that's as far back as I can go. If you think of it as, which evangelical Protestants would want to do, is stretching back to Jesus, then yeah, there would be this kind of growth and development that Roman Catholics would claim for Roman Catholicism, and Protestants would say, oh, well, that's probably, you know, Aquinas would have been a Presbyterian today, or, you know, whatever people say. But the key for me is there is something that's interesting post the 18th century, where we have, I mean, you guys are, this is the business school, so I don't have to tell you about like kind of economic productivity flatlining and then going boom. And it's no surprise that the champion, or at least from my kind of thesis, it's no surprise that the people that were doing that, you know, Adam Smith, actually, when he became a professor of moral philosophy in Scotland, he subscribed to the Westminster Confession of Faith, which conservative Presbyterian ministers have to subscribe to today. Now, I think that by the time he died, I think personally he probably still believed in God, but didn't have those confessional commitments. But I think that the response would be, well, what is it in the 18th century and forward that we see this kind of skyrocketing? That actually ties in nicely with your second question, which is causation. A constant conjunction, is to speak in the language of the Scottish philosopher David Hume, constant conjunction doesn't mean causation. So just because I see A and I see B, because I see A and I see B, I see A and I see B, doesn't mean that A causes B, right? So that's your second question. Is that fair to say? And that's where I would say that so there's the kind of philosophical puzzle of, yeah, how do we know, right? So there's a deeper philosophical question of, yeah, it's really thorny to understand causation anyway. But I do think that predictive power is something that we use to say A causes B. And I think that what the curiosity is, and this would be the kind of test case, would be that in the early, when China started liberalizing its economy in the early 1980s, is that when they just started doing the special cities? Was it early? 78? Okay, so 78. The hope was it's free trade. Free trade is going to make them a democracy, right? Or just any kind of trade. Being exposed to the outside world is going to make them a democracy. That hasn't happened. But we also know at the same time there's an explosion of Christians in China. And it used to be that I thought that the Chinese Christians were no threat to the ruling regime. And I think, as a simple matter of fact, and if you're a Chinese Communist Party member watching online, then I believe that they're perfectly lovely people. But perfectly lovely people. But what I would say is that the current regime is very concerned about Christians. And you can see why. Because Christians are concerned about free exchange of ideas. Christians are concerned about literacy. And I was in China for 2 weeks talking about toleration and the rule of law. And one of the things that was really interesting was I asked the person that the party had tasked to try to figure out the solution to the religion problem in China, if there was a button on this table and you could push the button, and by pushing the button you would give people religious liberty, the way that you gave the kind of economic zones some measure of economic freedom, would you push the button? And he said no. And the reason why he said no was he said no because in order to get religious liberty, this is exactly what he said, in order to give religious liberty, you have to give all the other freedoms, right? You give somebody religious liberty, all the other freedoms come with it. And so that would be the test case, is like 20 years from now, if the church in China continues to grow, then according to my model, then we would expect greater democratization. And just real quick, one of the funny problems that they have is that it's the elites in China that are converting to Christianity. And so if you've looked at Shaowang Church, it made national news, front page Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and I'm sure I'm not saying it correctly, Shaowang, whatever. But they actually, one of the problems that they have is they play catch and release. So right now they arrest a bunch of people, but then like the pastors they keep in arrest forever. But a lot of the people who are going are like the professional managerial class. So they arrest them and then they drive like 2 blocks and then they release them. So that would be it would be a promissory note, right? It's always great, like, I understand your objection. 20 years from now, we'll know whether or not I was right. Yes, sir?
I come from Afghanistan.
Okay.
My country believes in predominantly Islamic. But what fascinates me the most about the Western world is like the Western values, which is individuality, institutions, and
Yep.
their orientation to science and technology.
Yep.
But I try to make, put everything into context. Like I just look at the Islamic world, and why are we in trouble? Why is there war? And there's one answer: religion. That is driving lots of the crisis and conflicts. And then I study the Christian, the Western world. Why is there so much glory and greatness? And it's just those 3 values: institutions, individuality, and their orientation to science and technology. And when I read their history, it is bloody, and it's because of the religion. I mean, you look at the Maximilian Robespierre, 1793. He put the streets in Paris he turned it into bloodbath.
Yeah, but he wasn't religious.
I mean, no, he was a fundamentalist, Christian. That's what. If you read the book that is recently published by Jordan McChrystal, U.S. journal that was in charge of the war in Afghanistan. If you read like Robespierre, Maximilian Robespierre, terrible guy.
I agree.
Lots of people,
Yeah.
to the guillotine, send them to the guillotine. You look at the case in Rwanda. The church literally drove conflicts. It turned into a disaster.
Yeah.
Like the bloodiest civil war that we know in the history
Yeah.
was the war in Rwanda, and the church was behind it. So I don't know why would you reduce like Western civilization's greatness or achievements to religion?
Yeah. So the question is, aren't there religious counterexamples? So that Christianity has been a force for bad things. Is that fair?
No, it's not a force for a bad thing. I think the Judeo-Christian value do have some relevance in the achievements of the West.
Yep.
But if you reduce the achievements of the West like to Christianity, I think it's looking a lot more extreme.
Yep.
The Christians in Africa, extremely poor.
Yep.
They're not living in anything. Everything that I read the literature, just points me to those 3 things: individuality, institutions.
Yeah, so what you're saying is it's kind of a dovetail on the previous question. You're offering a counter explanation. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's not a counter. I mean, it's just like there is so much evidence, empirical evidence, like if you read these cases.
Yep.
In each case, when there was church in charge in the West, it was bloody. That period.
Yeah.
I mean,
This is actually really helpful because conversionary Protestants, so evangelicals, are against, historically, are both against state-established religion and also state control of religion. And so the New England colonists were actually the hardscrabble dissenters. So in the 1640s, I think it was 1648, when they killed the king, when they actually executed the king as a tyrant in England, I think it was 2 of the regicides actually fled to the colonies and found shelter. So they're not monarchical. Now, the reign of terror in France was decidedly anti-Christian. And if you think otherwise, we will just disagree. But they actually set up in the Cathedral of Notre Dame just a kind of altar to the Temple of Reason. So they were anti-Christian. But I think that there were certainly things that Christians did and that were horrible. And then the question then, and I haven't read the book yet, and I'm not even sure I'm going to get his name right, but I think it's Tom Holland, who just wrote a book, Dominion. I saw it reviewed, I think in the WSJ, where he's actually, I think, an atheist. And his argument, he used to believe that, like, it's not the religion, it's institutions. But in his new book, Dominion, he actually says the reason why the West is actually freer is because it's actually gotten more Christian and not less Christian. And so, and it's really interesting, Sam Gregg in his Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization, one of the things that he does, and this is where I was about to say I'm completely ignorant of Islam, but that's not true, because, I mean, I know a little bit, but he talked about a medieval movement in Islam, and it begins with an M, but that's all I've got, that was trying to make the case that the Islamic God was not voluntarist. So voluntarism says that something is right or wrong merely and only because God commands it. And that's not the Christian position. But they lost out. And so Sam Gregg actually quotes contemporary Islamic philosophers in the Middle East who are saying the reason why we won't actually develop these kinds of Western institutions is because the Islamic God is not the Western one. Now that may be wrong, but that seems plausible to me. Yeah.
You know, if you look at the Islamic world, the countries that have adopted the Western experience,
Yep.
which I just mentioned,
Yep.
institutions, individuality,
Yep.
And in the orientation to scientific, to science and technology.
Yeah.
You look at the experience of Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia. These are countries that are doing really, really well. And
I mean, Turkey's a despotic regime, right?
it's not an Islamic regime. It's
No, despotic. So Erdogan, I wouldn't want to live in Turkey.
Well, that's your choice, but,
Okay.
but it's a country that is, similar to so many other countries
Okay.
in Europe. And it's doing so well. Women are participating in the political process. Of course, lately it's become a little bit more fundamentalist, but by far, if you look at the countries, regardless of their religious orientation, if they have adopted the Western experience, they are doing far better. But I mean, and they're not like China. You
Yeah.
give it a great example.
Yeah, 100 million people lifted out of poverty.
It's a Western experience. Science is a Western experience. Individuality they have not adopted, and they're
Yeah.
trying to get it. They're doing really well. So I don't know why would you, go on, like to reduce like the Western achievements and glory, to religion, because, right now, if you look at Steve Jobs, like his background, some of the greatest innovators
Yeah.
in this country are not Christians,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
all over the world.
And I thought I made very clear that it may be that you wouldn't want a country with 95% evangelical Protestants, right? That actually there could be a 5 or 7.5%. But I think you had a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you, is your main premise, just like to clarify, just that the ideas of the Christian faith support innovation? Is that mainly what you're saying?
The background conditions. So I'm not saying Jesus rose from the dead, and I'm not trying to be blasphemous, but I'm not saying Jesus rose from the dead, therefore this is how you should wire a circuit chip or something like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there are certain background conditions that are fostered with Christianity. So you have a follow-up?
Yes,
Yeah.
and then you brought up what was going on in China,
Sure.
currently with how the government's very fearful of the new influx of Christianity in China.
Yep.
And you said that's almost, would you at all mirror that to Nero back in the original, whenever Christianity was just becoming popular, how the government was so fearful of the Christian faith because maybe it was large government control and more towards freedom of religion? Would you say that at all mirrors that?
I mean, it could.
It's different.
I'm not a historian, so I'd be reluctant to say that, China is playing the role of Nero. But I mean, there could be parallels. It's nice because it reminds me that one of the reasons why the elites started converting or being interested in Christianity was because they actually said they really wanted to study Western institutions and say, what is it? And they actually found Christianity as a very attractive component of the Western experiment. Yep. Yes?
Yeah, so my question might be a little bit
Sure.
I was thinking that historically, like the role that religion was playing in the government and politics has never played more than today. And I think today's governments are more successful in building the social capital. So if you just like take a correlation between the role of religion in the government and building social capital, it's just like the clear inverse relationship.
Well,
So how you can argue or like explain like, okay, now that like prime ministers and presidents might like have like be religious, but they're not like putting those religious in their government, so that's why they're racist.
and why would we have that sensibility? So if the question is why would we have this? Why would we have the sensibility that we would want our governors, our rulers, to be really good at governing, independent of their religious positions? What would give in the West? What would foster that impulse?
Because individuals, because religion is limiting in many ways.
Well, I mean, historically, Martin Luther said, I'd rather have a prince who was a Turk and who actually was really good at being a prince than a prince who was a very good Christian and incompetent. And I think it goes back to the words of Jesus, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God's what is God's. So I would say that if you look at the history of kind of evangelical Christianity, absent, say, the Trump era in which we now live, but historically there has been a concern to separate these, and you see, I mean, I could afterwards I can point to specific historical examples. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, we'll take one last question.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let me see if I can.
And I'll talk to you afterwards, I promise.
A lot of interesting thought, and I'm wondering if, part of the issue of the successful people in this country who are not Christians, I think as you stated, and clarify if I'm wrong, but that, it's kind of the soil that's been tilled, because freedom comes from, really, ultimately, God has given us all freedom.
Mhm.
Our country is founded on, and there has to be a law. And for our country to succeed, there has to be a morality to it all working.
Mhm.
And I think it's interesting, the foundation of property law, which in all countries has, been a foundation, at least the beginning of success, because keeping the fruit of your labor. All of these are biblical principles. And I'm just, when I think of totalitarianism, communism, socialism, there's also the idea that Christianity, in this country, it was very important for the Christians not to have politics or the religion be a state religion. So there's this freedom for individuality and freedom to innovate that under totalitarianism, communism, it's this structure too that is very Machiavellian. The ends justify the means, and there's not that freedom.
Yeah, and let's remember that Marx was a man of the West, even though he was anti-Western, right? So Karl Marx was a product of the West, but he was anti-Western. This is why I think Friedrich Hayek, gave a hat tip to Christianity with individualism. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard this Dutchman, or maybe it was Afrikaans, say that if you look at all the countries of the world where Reformed Christianity, which evangelical Protestantism would be a branch of, they've never fallen under totalitarian authority from the inside. They've never voted to say, like, hey, let's be a totalitarian regime, or let's be a fascist enterprise. And I think it is because of a concern for individual freedom and liberty. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Do I say howdy at the end?
No.
Okay. What do I say? Thank you. Is that
Just say
that?
thank you,
Yeah.
right.
I want to live in Aggie land, right? Yeah.
Thank you to Professor Bruce. Thank you for everyone to show. I have a quick question just by survey. Raise your hand if you are amazed